Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to Fatality Review, the State of the Art. I'm Neil Websdale. I direct the Family Violence Institute at NAU, and I also direct the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative, which is a grant-funded initiative funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. So my purpose today is really just to provide an overview of fatality review, what's going on in the field. I'm going to speak in generalities. Obviously, I'm referring to the states as a whole, so there's a lot of difference, a lot of variability. But I want to start by talking about the historical origins of domestic violence fatality review. I've been doing this work personally now since really around 1997, 96, 97. And so there are some things, I think, cultural issues that we want to pay attention to, just to acknowledge. First of all, I think there's always been a public outcry about intimate partner homicide. But when these teams, fatality review teams, started to form, it was clear that many of them formed because of the anger and outcry at intimate partner homicides, which were mostly involving female victims. I think clearly, too, there was a correspondence between this and the rise of second-wave feminism, changes in gender relationships more broadly, the rise of women's education and paid employment, changes in various sectors, employment sectors. There's also a clear link between the rise of fatality review and the sort of broader milieu of civil rights, the new civil rights movement, which we trace back to the late 50s and 60s. Of course, the first civil rights movement occurring after the Civil War. But we also must note the rise in divorce, particularly no-fault divorce, and women's growing control over their reproductive health. So these were a number of factors that provided sort of a broad cultural context. Much more specifically, the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, originally in 1994, provided major impetus for the development of fatality review initiatives in this country. And VAWA, the Office on Violence Against Women, has funded our initiative since around that time and has funded many fatality review initiatives in the States as well. And of course, globally, these initiatives have taken form in various other liberal democracies across the world, including Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Portugal, and elsewhere. So we must also include, though, I think, the rise of what the sociologists refer to as risk societies and growing concerns about things like technological developments that were transnational. For example, the growth of aviation, global transportation, the growth of nuclear power, the expansion of medicine. In those sectors, we saw a number of tragic outcomes that had pretty significant impacts that transcended national boundaries in their implications. So the rise of risk societies and the rise of risk assessment in general is inextricably linked to the rise of fatality review in terms of domestic violence work. We also need to note, I think something of great importance was what some people refer to as the victim rights revolution. This happened both sides of the Atlantic. In the 1970s, the US Supreme Court, particularly in 1973, began to issue various opinions on victim rights. Again, we see the same in the UK. Criminologist David Garland referred to this as the return of the victim, because victims, of course, in the colonial revolutionary period, crimes were often investigated and prosecuted by victims themselves. So in a sense, there was, from the 70s onwards, a resurfacing of the role of the victim in the criminal justice system and a subsequent acknowledgement of the rights of victims and the trauma that they had faced. So we see a particular spur in the early 2000s with the passage of the Victim Rights Act in 2004. And we saw a correspondence between the passage of that legislation and the growing number of requests from surviving family members to contribute in various ways to the fatality review process. And that's something that's continued to this day. It's a very powerful, potent voice in the field, and an enormously helpful voice in terms of providing us with additional perspectives and lenses through which to look at these homicides. Now, there have been obviously critiques of the victim rights movement as well, in the sense that it maybe undermines the rights of the accused, it impinges upon prosecutorial discretion, and in some ways it opens up the door to sort of vengeful involvement in the criminal justice process. In terms of fatality review, it's obviously opened up the possibility of vengeful voices at tables, which may or may not be considered useful by fatality reviewers. Now, I want to drift into now a consideration about some of the bigger picture things that fatality review teams have been doing over the years, but I want to start with just a caution. And it's a quote from Mark Twain, variously attributed actually to other people as well, but what Twain says at one point is that most people use statistics like a drunk man uses a lamppost, more for support than illumination. Now, I like to preface my presentations now using this quote because we have to be very careful about these statistics that are out there, the crime statistics, particularly regarding domestic violence, because there's so much missing data in these cases. It's so difficult to unearth the complexities of these cases, particularly in fatality reviews. So that caution notwithstanding, we want to look at some recent developments. Now, if we look at the Violence Policy Center data from the mid-90s, the picture it paints with regard to the killings of women by men is obviously bleak in the sense that any killing is one too many, but that some people have interpreted this decreasing rate as a hopeful sign. That, in other words, intimate partner homicides are declining, the rates are declining, and that this parallels an even steeper decline in the actual incidence of domestic violence, intimate partner violence itself. And the Bureau of Justice Statistics data on IPV, intimate partner violence, comports with this curve as well. So we may like to think and pat ourselves on the back with all the work that we do and say, this is progress. And it's not that I want to be, to use Leonard Cohen's phrase, the grocer of despair, but there are other things that we need to pay attention to. If you look at this data from Stratmann and Thomas that was published in 2016, a more complicated picture emerges. If we look at the homicide rate nationally in general, not just the intimate partner homicide rate, but the homicide rate nationally, you can see, or maybe not see from this graph, that the lines on the bottom, the curve on the bottom here, refers to homicides, and the homicide rate is 92% in 2014. The homicide rate is 92% of what it was in the mid-60s. In other words, there's been a decline. Peaked in the mid-90s, went down. And you may think that this is a good development, and the homicide rate going down, but look at the aggravated assault data, and this comports with what I hear in the field all the time from county attorneys. While the homicide rate nationally may have gone down from the mid-60s, it looks like there's been, and the numbers here are 219% increase in 2014 compared to 1964. So something's going on there. And in terms of other research in the field on intimate partner violence in general, Sylvia Walby published an important piece in the British Journal of Criminology in 2015, which addresses her research methodology of taking the data on intimate partner violence more seriously and looking at how these statistics are generated. And what she did was lift the caps off the counts in the United Kingdom. And actually in the United Kingdom, you can see here from the second bullet, the cap is 5. If there are more than 5 assaults in a year, they're still counted as 5. So if they're 35, it's 5. What Walby did was lift the caps off and look at the real data, and what she found was an actual increase in the frequency of violent crime, and particularly violence against women, from the 2008 recession. And she argued that what we're seeing there over this last decade in England is the disproportionate effect on women of resource reductions and changes in earning patterns for poorer women subject to violence in the home. So this just muddies the waters, and I want to put it out there. I think in general, and this is something that a little slide I put together over the years, it's clear to us that intimate partner homicide follows social patterns, follows patterns of race, social class, ethnicity, and obviously gender. These offenses are profoundly gendered. As a fatality reviewer, I'm talking anecdotally now. I'm not basing this on any published research, but I would say roughly half of the intimate partner homicides in the US have prior systems contact, but they exhibit relatively low levels of collaboration, communication, and coordination amongst the various entities involved in those cases. In other words, agencies and stakeholders who may or may not have served victims of violence traditionally battered women. And if we look at the other 50% of cases, female victims appear to die in relative isolation, with relatively few or no systems contacts. So this begs the question, given the services that we offer, what is it about those systems that, for some reason, many battered women are not availing themselves of and end up dying in isolation? So these are important big picture questions. We also know from our fatality review work and our research work in general that these intimate partner homicides and other domestic violence deaths, but particularly the intimate partner homicides, are stylized. They have telltale histories with specific patterns of risk in them, risk markers in them. And I'll return to this in just a moment. But there are a couple of other things that help us understand in the big picture what is perhaps going on with intimate partner homicide. If we look again from the mid-70s, the steepest declines in intimate partner homicide are amongst the African American community, and particularly African American males. There are many reasons for this. We're not sure what this means, but perhaps the infiltration of the African American inner city, where these rates tend to be higher, by emergency medical services might be one of the reasons. In other words, what would have been a homicide 30 and 40 years ago is now perhaps an ag assault or a near death. So the medical interventions have improved dramatically. And there's research out there, very interesting research, which speaks to the impact of this. One of the pieces of research comes from Harris et al. Other research comes from the CDC. And you can see that the rate reductions in intimate partner homicide have corresponded with improvements in medical services. So the CDC data, if we look from 2011, the number of people wounded seriously by gunshots to require a hospital stay rather than treatment and release rose almost by half in that decade from 01 to 11. That's a very significant increase, and that observation comports with the aggravated assault data that I presented earlier. Information from the trauma centers all over the country also find a decrease in the death rate for victims admitted to things like stab wounds. Now, Harris et al. Looked at the homicide research over a pretty long period of time, and what they concluded was that the average rate of 15 to 20,000 homicides in the US between 94 and 99, and we'll remember that this was a period when we had, sort of significantly more gang killings and drug trade killings in the inner city. That 15 to 20,000 a year would have been 45 to 70,000 a year, but for improvements in medical interventions. So Harris et al. Estimate that medical care reduced the lethality of violent assaults by 2.5% to 4.5% a year. That corresponds with the rise of trauma centers and what we've learned from saving lives in the campaigns, the military campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq. So modern wound care, antisepsis, antibiotics, anesthesia, fluid replacement, trauma surgery, better communications between emergency docs, the opening up of the inner city, the ability for EMTs to get to scenes faster, all those things have lowered the homicide rate. Whether they've specifically lowered the intimate partner homicide rate is a question that we need researchers to address. Now, I also want to point to a couple of other issues. It's very clear from research from the FBI and from the Secret Service, published recently, that there is an overlap between mass killings and the perpetrators having histories of committing domestic violence offenses. And this overlap, I don't need to go into this in detail, but the overlap is there. The common themes here, the common threads with these offenders and intimate partner homicide offenders are that they typically tend to be men, and they live in relative isolation. They attempt to instill fear into others, and they have a deep-seated, very deep-seated sense of grievance. And these are the common themes across these case types. So it's just something to note. Now, fatality review teams across the country, and there are 44 states doing review work and also review work in other countries, as I mentioned, review cases in very broad ways. I mean, state statutes differ, the enabling statutes, in terms of what they'll allow teams to review, but I just wanted to address the kinds of deaths that teams all over the country are reviewing to varying degrees. So, obviously, one of the staples is intimate partner homicide, mostly involving men killing women, but sometimes the other way around. Both case types are very valuable for teams to review. Multiple homicides are much rarer. Familicides in particular, where the whole family is killed typically, are much rarer still, probably number 50 or less a year in the United States. Suicides, however, are significant. 95% of these involve men killing women and then killing themselves. And those cases, about a third of the women who lose their lives in intimate partner homicides every year in this country lose them in multiple killings, particularly homicide-suicides. So this is a significant number of cases, and with the homicide-suicides, we don't have the same issues of a pending criminal prosecution or any appellate issues because both parties are dead. So those cases traditionally have been easier cases for teams to take. Some teams are looking at family killings, which are probably similar in number to the intimate partner homicides every year at least. Here we see parents killing children, children killing parents, brothers killing brothers, sisters killing sisters, much more rarely than brothers killing brothers. But these are the kinds of cases. And again, teams have taken to reviewing these because they fall under the domestic violence statutes. Sexual competitor killings, we see men mostly killing men over women. We sometimes see women killing women over men, but that's much rarer. Some people in the field tell me that this is because men aren't worth it. Of course, that's not true, but there we go. Huge areas that remain unexplored, that need to be explored, are the suicides of men and women. As we know, the suicide rate is significantly higher than the homicide rate, and we genuinely believe that a large number of women a year exit violent and controlling relationships by taking their own lives. That number is probably much higher than lose their lives through intimate partner homicide. We have no idea about the suicides of men in relation to domestic violence. This literature is just barely opening up, but teams have reviewed some of these cases to great effect, and begs the question, first of all, are these men perpetrators of domestic violence who are depressed, who take their own lives? Are these men victims of domestic violence? Again, we just don't know. There are indirect deaths, HIV-related deaths, the deaths of homeless women, the deaths of drug addicts, the deaths of sex workers. Many of these women have histories of domestic violence in their lives, and some teams have taken to reviewing those deaths as a way of opening up the problem of domestic violence and linking it perhaps with public health initiatives, epidemiological initiatives, etc. And that, of course, is very fertile ground for teams. A number of states now have passed a near fatality review, enabling amendments that enable them to review near deaths. In other words, simply put, there but for the grace of a medical intervention, there would have been a homicide. And again, those cases are valuable because we have a survivor to talk with us potentially. Bystander deaths, accidents, disappearances, etc. are also eminently reviewable. Now, cases have telltale markers, and we do separate presentations on what happens before an intimate partner homicide, so I don't want to spend any time at all really talking about these risk markers, but we do ask teams to explore these. And things like prior histories of domestic violence, separation in the relationship, emotional estrangement, extreme jealousy, depression, the suicidal potential of the offender, drug and alcohol use patterns, and the presence of stepchildren in the home, and what I like to refer to as the usually the male perpetrator's humiliated fury, sort of a compromised sense of masculinity at the heart of many of these male-perpetrated intimate partner homicides. So these are some of the markers, and we do unravel these in much more detail in other webinars that we offer. So let me go on now and talk more substantively about the process of domestic violence fatality review. And I'll start with just a pat definition. Review teams identify and analyze homicides, suicides, other deaths, and indeed, as I've said earlier, near deaths caused by, related to, or somehow traceable to domestic violence. And that broad-ranging definition is important so that teams can flexibly use their statutory provisions to explore different case types. We know that the social harm caused by domestic violence is very, very wide-ranging. Wide-ranging in terms of case type and wide-ranging in terms of the impact of the damage over the life course, the injuries to families and communities. So we wanted to have a very broad starting definition. The reviews can be formal, they can be informal, they can range greatly in depth and number, and teams are there to essentially devise what they think might be preventive interventions. Now, this is a photograph of a radioactive wolf taken from Chernobyl. And this sort of allows me segue into what I want to talk about, which I think is very important. I believe the evidence speaks to this dramatically. I want to talk about the philosophy of doing domestic violence fatality review. If we look at the research into the Chernobyl explosion, and indeed the research into Fukushima, which happened in Japan in 2011 with the tsunami there, what we find is that the Soviet Union, for example, in Chernobyl, this happened in 1986, the Soviets had known for 20 years at least before Chernobyl, before this catastrophe that resulted in a 1,000-mile exclusion zone, many deaths and phenomenal illness and tragic outcomes after that explosion. What the Soviets knew for 20 years before that was that they had problems, safety problems, they had many risks with their nuclear industry, their nuclear power industry, but they didn't discuss those risks. They didn't subject them to review. They kept quiet about much of this stuff, and people in nuclear plants in the Soviet Union just didn't have access to the kind of knowledge that they needed to put these situations right. So the radioactive wolf here is really a symbol of that ineffective review philosophy. Hush things up, don't talk about it, rather than reviewing things carefully. Now, I apologize for this slide. I've been told at some conferences that I shouldn't share this because it's offensive to folks. So just look away if you don't want to look at this one. But when we look at the medical error deaths in the United States, there are roughly 250,000 deaths a year that are preventable medical errors each year in the United States. Much work remains to be done in the United States to improve mortality reviews in the field of medicine. And you talk with docs, they will tell you this. We could do much better. There are many reasons for this. One of them is a concern with litigation, but there are other concerns. And there's a reluctance to create a subculture of review in the field of medicine to review these tragic outcomes. So let's contrast these situations. Let's contrast the radioactive wolf and the 250,000 deaths a year with a much more open, transparent, perhaps threatening review subculture in the field of commercial aviation in the United States. And this is a photograph of the plane that Captain Chesley Sullenberger landed on the Hudson River after he'd flown it into a flock of geese. Now, I'm sure he didn't do this deliberately, but nevertheless, that's what happened. Seized up the engines, the plane lost altitude. Sullenberger, for many, heroically landed this on the Hudson River and saved all those lives. When he was asked about this, he was, eulogized for this in many ways, or appreciated as a hero after this. But what he told people in interviews subsequent to the landing was that this was nothing to do with heroics. This was to do with 40 years of reviewing tragic outcomes and creating a sense of teamwork in the cockpit and in commercial aviation by bringing folks together under the auspices of the National Transportation Safety Board to have lots of differing opinions on what happened before crashes and to have information out there that people could learn from. Knowledge is power, and we can reduce the crash rate. The crash rate these days is phenomenally lower than it was 40 years ago. And commercial aviation, we're looking at 100, 200 deaths a year compared with 250,000 in medicine and tragic outcomes in nuclear power. This is the reason why we encourage fatality review teams to work as an expert team, not as a group of individual experts, but as Sullenberger said, we take individual experts from people who are experts in selling tickets, to collecting bags, to serving drinks on planes, to junior pilots, to mechanics, to captains in cockpit crews, and we review cases with those and other experts from the NTSB, and we put things right. And that's what we've tried to do with our guiding philosophy and fatality review. It's been a shining light for us in terms of moving forward. So the DVFR philosophy is no blame and shame, and we genuinely mean that. We want accountability. We want to learn these lessons from other fields, and we want to create a culture of safe reviewing. That doesn't mean to say it's comfortable reviewing. It's just safe in terms of we're not going to be pointing fingers at individual agencies. I'm in fact doing a death review this month, and I probably shouldn't say where it was clear there was some things that could have been done better. But I know full well that the agencies involved in that particular tragic outcome would probably be the first to acknowledge that. And that's what we find. We don't put all these professionals and stakeholders together and end up with a cover-up. That's not been the case. What we end up with is candid discussions of the way that we can do things in the future. So we're creating or trying to create a culture of safety. And we work with a philosophy of kindness. If you really want to blame someone, I guess you could blame the batterer, who's ultimately responsible in these cases, the person who pulled the trigger. But it's very important for us to recognize the role of all these social forces that I talked about earlier. And often what we see is what poses as racial or ethnic disadvantage in domestic violence deaths, what poses as racial patterning may be something else. It may in fact be the effects of concentrated poverty, and teams explore these things. So we note the significance of these social forces and encourage teams to do that. Now, I wanted to say a few words about the geographical spread of fatality review. When we started this work, I started writing these grants back in the mid-90s when I was working for the Lawton Charles administration in Florida. And, so from the mid-90s onwards to 2018, there are roughly 200 teams in various ways embedded in communities in 44 states. Those teams are in various stages of engagement in their communities. Some of them are quieter than others. Some of them review more frequently than others. Some of them won't review a case for a year or even two. But the apparatus is there to review if the case comes along. So there's, again, tremendous variation. It's hard for us at our initiative to track the activity levels of all of these teams all the time. But there are statewide teams in states like Montana, for example, New Mexico, some fabulous work being done in these places, in Oklahoma, for example. And these are states that tend to have lower populations, lower numbers of homicides. The Montana team, for example, reviews 2 cases a year. The statewide team, the Indian Country team up in Montana, reviews also 2 cases a year. The bigger states with more teams like Florida, California, Maryland, they've got at least 20 teams in those states. Arizona, we have 13. And there are some states that are currently not reviewing. I've listed those. You can see here graphically those developments. I've just put that up for you. But a significant spread that is hard for us to account for easily. I suspect this has to do with the outrage in these communities about these deaths, the concern, but I think it also has to do with people's genuine civic engagement. As we learn more about domestic violence, we learn more about the harms caused by these offenses, the bringing together of folks to try to solve this at a community or a state level really is a reflection, I think, in many ways of sort of local democratic activity, genuine engagement of the populace in these tragic outcomes and these social harms. So some teams, a few words about forms and organizations. Teams do this differently. There's tremendous variation. And this variation in the United States reflects the political organization of the country. This is a system, it's a federal system, so we have the influences of the federal government, we have the influences of the states, and at county and local level, we also have county municipal government as well. So we see all of these different overarching forms and forms of reciprocation in the nature of the review processes themselves. So it's very hard for me to generalize. But nowadays, if I were to say a few generic things, teams operate as multi-agency, multi-stakeholder bodies, and they do so with an interdisciplinary focus. And good teams accommodate different perspectives. This is critical. We learned this in aviation review. We want different voices at the table. It's almost as if, when we train, it's almost as if we encourage people to play devil's advocate, to take a different position. Well, it could have been this, it could have been that. The kiss of death with these reviews is to think with any certainty what happened before you come into the review and before you've engaged in the discussion. So there are some teams with overarching statewide apparatuses, like the Florida statewide death review team, which is organized through the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence, doing some fabulous work, working with probably 25 county-based teams in various stages of activity. So those teams report to the statewide organization that puts out a really wonderful Faces of Fatality report on an annual basis. So there are many organizations like this. If you look at the Georgia Fatality Review Commission, a shout out to the Georgia folks. I've spent some time recently going through their reports. Tremendous work, really digging down deep into some of these cases, getting a sense of the compromises that victims face as they move through to these tragic outcomes. So in general, a word about scope and reviewable cases. Obviously, the reviewable cases are going to depend upon the enabling statute that allows teams to look at this case type or that. The number of cases that teams review varies tremendously. Their methodologies review, the methodologies that they use vary tremendously. How they do their work. Some teams interview large numbers of people. I'm doing a webinar in about a month's time on a particular case we reviewed in the state of Montana, which involved the team doing 35 community interviews, of which I personally did 9, and we spent a lot of time synthesizing that interview data. That was a major component of the review, in addition to the thousands of pages of transcripted material. So you have that level of a very, very deep dive into the case, and other reviews are more fleeting, more cursory perhaps, don't go into the cases in that level of depth. Some teams just do sort of more aggregate data gathering. And it just depends on the team's capabilities. The idea of being scientific with these cases is somewhat problematic because, as I said earlier, the cases do tend to have large amounts of missing data, and because the number of states that actually have large numbers of cases to produce a statistically significant n size to generate sort of meaningful statistical analyses, those states are relatively few. So typically teams choose cases, and this is an important exercise, case selection. What cases do we select? How many do we select? And really, the case types correspond with the list I laid out earlier, but the team itself chooses how many cases to review. And I think the golden rule is review within your capabilities. As a team, what are you comfortable with? You're all busy people. You do great work aside from this, and this is added on to your job typically. So how to do this in a way that works for the team. Now with team membership here, this is a Lowry painting from England. He used to paint scenes from the sort of industrial north in England. But I included this. I apologize for cutting the tops of the heads off a few of these characters. But I wanted to get a point across with this piece of art. Team membership ought to be wide-ranging and eclectic. As we learn with aviation review, the more the merrier, the greater the range of perspectives, the better. We don't want everybody sitting at the table singing the same song. We want respectful differences of opinion, difference in interpretation of facts, so that we learn from each other. This has been an enormous boost for us to learn these lessons from aviation. We want to be inclusive. I don't mean this in some politically correct way. We want to be creative. We want to include folks in the community. So if we think that battered women, for example, in our communities shared stories with pastors, some teams have come to the conclusion that including representatives from faith communities would be very helpful. And we have found that victims of violence, women, sometimes men even, have shared these stories within their faith communities. And we recommended very early on that teams include representatives from faith communities, because victims are more willing perhaps to share their stories with those representatives than they are with victim advocates, than they are perhaps with law enforcement at crime scenes. So we want to build in these multiple lenses so that we bring the light in and we see the case through different angles. So we tilt the lens a little bit now and again. We see the light come in different ways. One of the great dangers of doing reviews is that we come in with a sort of a sense of certainty or zealotry or fundamentalism. Let's review this case to show the power and control, for example, of the perpetrator. This kind of approach may feel good. It may feel good with the group that you're a part of or something. Or if you're a psychologist, you may come in and let's see if we can show how this person suffered from psychopathology from the earliest times or something. These are very narrow, and as W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet, said once, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, but that's a caution about the dangers of being fundamentalist in our approach to this work. We want to involve family, friends, neighbors, co-workers. When we analyze cases, we might want to put some of our generic findings and our recommendations out into the community through focus groups of survivors so that we get their perspective. In other words, we want the team membership to reflect the community, because the problem of intimate partner homicide, domestic violence, killings, these are community problems. These are not criminal justice problems. So there are those who first objected to family members being present because they said family members are going to be pissed off, they're going to be angry, they're going to be vengeful, and they're going to want to know stuff that we can't tell them because of the statutory confidentiality shields. And our response to that was always, we can absorb that into these review teams. We want those perspectives, but we need to be clear with family members about what we can and can't tell them. So when review teams set up, and I'm saying this really, in acknowledgement of the people who are on the call here today who are perhaps new, who may be considering setting teams up, we at the initiative, we at ndvfri.org, which you can see there on the bottom of that bullet, the last bullet, we provide technical assistance to communities that want to do that. Whatever stage of development they're in, if they're getting started, if they're teams that are regrouping after maybe a decade of work, we do come in and we actually engage in that work. And as someone who serves permanently on the Indian Country Review Team in Montana, many of our staff at the initiative serve actively on teams as well as doing the work that we do. So we have a lot of experience reviewing cases. But one of the starting points is enabling statutes. What does the statute enable you to do? Fatality review is about reinforcing the rule of law. It's about improving the legitimacy and credibility of the rule of law. So we want to make sure that all the activities that team members engage in are legal and that they respect those legal strictures. We want to identify stakeholders that we want to bring in, and we want a very broad-ranging base. We want to develop protocols. We don't want to waste a lot of time doing this, but we want to get some broad ideas about how we want to do this, how we're going to house the documents, how we're going to send out meeting notices, generate reports. And again, we have stuff up on our website on how to write reports, how to do all this stuff. So I refer you to the website, how we're going to develop confidentiality agreements. All these things are up on the website to get you started, to move you through, to help you create mission statements. We've got a plethora of reports up there. We are constantly in a losing battle in terms of keeping the reports up there. It's expensive for us to do that. But we now have a fabulous IT manager, Ray Chara, who is helping us move this forward. So we'll be trying to keep ahead of the game with that. So for those that are just starting, I wanted to say a few words about statutes, statutory developments. If you're thinking of developing a statute, introducing legislation to facilitate fatality review in your state, and there aren't that many states left, but if you're thinking of doing that, if you're thinking of introducing an executive order to get that done, then a couple of cautions, I guess. You want to probably make sure that you state clearly that you're only reviewing deaths where the investigation is closed, there's no pending prosecution, and that the appellate issues have been closed out. You obviously don't want to interfere with those criminal justice processes. I want to be clear too that at NDVFRI we are not permitted to lobby for legislation or do anything that can be construed as lobbying. This is part of our cooperative agreement with the US Department of Justice. But we will provide advice on specific aspects, generic aspects of, developing a statute. So, for example, we would advise teams not to write subpoena power into the workings of the team because that tends to have a punitive feel to it, and it tends to conflict with our philosophy of building rapport, building bridges between folks, involving agencies, involving family members, etc. Now, the review process itself, and when we provide technical assistance to communities, which we do all the time, and we do this at big national conferences as well. Our team was recently in Dallas, Texas, where a couple of us facilitated mock reviews with groups. So we have specific technical assistance where we conduct those reviews in the field. We condense cases down and distill them into a 2 to 3 hour activity that folks can just sort of get their feet wet. But basically, what we're talking about with organizing a review is setting up a timeline that the group contributes to, identifying those red flags or risk markers or the antecedents, things that happen before the death, prior agency, stakeholder, and community involvement, and very importantly, the key question there, in addition to sort of noting which agencies were involved, the key question there is, what is the degree of collaboration, communication, coordination between those various entities? That's the key. It was the same in the cockpit. What they learned after 40 years of aviation crashes was one of the key concerns, one of the key causes of crashes was human error, and in the cockpit, the refusal of captains to listen to other people, particularly co-pilots. Domineering captains in cockpits led to a number of tragic outcomes, and they learned this in the 70s and the 80s with flights. And again, we've taken this parallel. We need to learn to work together to communicate better, to create a shared language. And this is why there's such incredibly powerful correspondence between emerging notions of community-informed risk assessment and fatality review. These two dovetail with each other and obviously help us create shared languages of understanding in these cases about intervening and triaging dangerous cases out. Teams, point number 4, teams make policy recommendations, social action items. How can we change things? And we're not talking here about altering world hunger or doing this kind of thing. We leave that to other arenas. We're talking about much more modest gains in terms of how cases are handled. What can we do? And then finally, we ask teams to keep questions, notes about things they need to go back to the community for in terms of gathering other information. So that's the organization of the review. Now, there are numerous data sources that teams can use, and this is very difficult for me to talk about because there's such variation across states. There's such variation in terms of what statutes allow, confidentiality privileges, privacy stuff, etc. But in general, if you're looking at your homicides and you're in a big urban area, so for example, when we worked with our friends in Detroit to help set up the review initiative in Detroit, one of the things that we recommended they do was to first of all go to their annual police homicide logs to get a sense of how many cases were out there. And then to go through those logs, identify the DV cases, but also identify the cases that may have been DV cases that were coded differently, that weren't coded as DV cases. So that's a starting point to identify cases. Another is newspaper reports of homicides. I mean, for example, if you look at the fabulous work done by the Arizona Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, you know, they've collected data on the number of deaths over the last 20 years due to domestic violence in the state of Arizona, and they list them out, and they give brief synopses based on the newspapers and their search engines of these cases. So that's another way of moving forward to identify a broad base of cases from which team members can choose. Then obviously we go into more detailed stuff, crime scene data, transcripts of notes taken with folks involved like family members, friends, co-workers, etc., civil court data potentially, criminal histories, child protective service data if it's accessible or not. It's always good to have cross-representation with child death reviewers on adult fatality review teams, and we have a lot of contacts. I have a lot of personal contact with Michael Durfee, who spearheaded the child death review movement in this country, published some fabulous work on this in the medical journals. But you know, that overlap, that cross-referencing is really important, cross-representation. We estimate that in about half of child maltreatment deaths in this country, there's an adult context of domestic violence amongst the adult parties or guardians, parents. Medical examiner reports, autopsy reports, workplace information. You may or may not have access to shelter advocacy information if that is available. This is a controversial area, and we have materials on our website that speak to those issues. Drug and alcohol treatment data may or may not be available. You know, statements from neighbors, families, etc. I've already mentioned. You know, orders of protection from courts, affidavits written in request of orders of protection, school data, again, to the extent that this is legally permissible. Now, those data gathering sources are one thing, and I just want to be really clear about this. Teams differ in their capacity to gather information. We know this. If you're a small rural team, you review one or you know, maybe 2 cases in a year or 2 years, and you have a smaller membership on your team, you may not be able to gather more than, say, 80 data points on a review. If you're doing this in an instrument at all, you may just be doing it as a conversation. You may not have a data gathering instrument, which is perfectly fine. Some teams that are more substantial, like the Miami Death Review Initiative, they may be able to collect data on 250 data points. So a word for those folks who do data gathering and have data domains. There are a number of different domains that we notice, and we are currently working on creating a clearinghouse. OVW have funded us to invite representatives from 20 teams in this country to Flagstaff, Arizona, to our Family Violence Institute, to work on the creation of 3 tiers of data gathering instruments so we can begin a process of secure, confidential, common reporting of de-identified case types. We have confidentiality attorneys working with us. We have IT specialists working with us. And again, a shout out to Ray, who's going to be working on this project. We have statisticians working on this project. So the idea is to provide a sort of 30,000-foot view of what's going on across the country to get at some of the bigger picture questions about agency coordination or not, and the kinds of public policy developments that we might need to make. I want to move on now and say a few words about the role of family members. This has been one of the most important developments in the field of fatality review over the last 15 years. It's provided us with an enormous amount of information. In a significant number of deaths, as I said, victims did not have contact with agencies. So there's a dearth of agency data. This differs from cases where victims have 30 different agencies and sets of stakeholders working with them. This is a different kind of case review. But the family members are important for both types of case review. And it is a rare case where agencies worked in concert with a battered woman prior to her demise, which speaks well about working in concert with victims, safety planning, and providing those tax-supported services that victims so sorely need and might benefit from. So the idea is to get at those compromises, and family members are in a position to tell us about how victims perceived the compromises that they faced, why it was difficult for them to do A, B, or C, why it was difficult for them to follow through, for example, with an order of protection, why they recanted. They help us understand, for example, the seemingly counterintuitive behavior of victims. And these insights are rich and important, but they can also be very uncomfortable. Surviving family members agitated, in some cases, for a presence at the table. And I remember talking with a police officer who had lost his daughter in an intimate partner homicide case. It was a Florida case back in the mid-90s. And I remember talking with him about the loss of his daughter. And he said, basically, I demand a seat at the table to be heard about what happened in my daughter's case. And I've heard that many times over the years. So the role of family members is critical. Now, some family members want to contribute, others don't. Obviously, if they don't, then they don't contribute. Family members, though, when they do contribute, often tell us that their experiences were cathartic. It was beneficial for them. It's very important for team members to be clear with family members. You know, we don't need to treat family members with kid gloves. Family members have been to hell and back. You know, I often hear people tell me, sort of reviewers who are new to it, well, we don't want to re-traumatize family members, therefore we're not going to approach them. This is basically, I think what they're saying is it's a projection. You know, we don't want to traumatize ourselves by approaching those who've experienced death like this. So we encourage folks to reach out to family members, but to communicate the limits. You know, there are things you don't come to the table if you come to the review table, if that's the way you're going to do this, or you don't sit in your home and ask the fatality reviewer whether or not my deceased daughter was a crack addict or whether she tested positive for HIV, if the team knows that. The family member doesn't have the right to ask those questions. In some ways, it's a one-way street, but it's an important one-way street. So the family member gets a chance to talk with the team, and the team gets a chance to ask questions, pertinent questions. The key there is to be prepared, to know the files, and to ask folks questions. This includes the family members of perpetrators. This is very important. I'm a great believer in reviewing cases through interviewing the family members of perpetrators and indeed perpetrators themselves. And Dr. Kathleen Ferraro and I have a webinar in 2 weeks' time on the role of collateral interviews in fatality review and asking people in the field through the interview medium, what they knew about the case. The stepmother in the Rocky Mosier case in Montana, this is a case that was reviewed. This is public record. I can share this information. Sarah Mosier, Rocky's stepmother, actually came to the table, and she'd been criticized before because she'd spawned a monster. And she was relieved after she'd worked with the review team. They wanted to hear from her. They were respectful. The exchange was important, and we learned a lot of things about Rocky's life and indeed the trauma that Rocky experienced in his life, that we couldn't have learned from any other mechanism. I want to say a few words now about confidentiality. This is a very, very important issue. We have 3 sources of information. We have 3 documents up on our website. One written by Robin Thompson, which was an older document on the sort of a general overview of the principles of confidentiality as they pertain to tribal, federal, state, local law, and some of the dissonances between those different bodies of information. We have a piece written by Nina Zollo, who is the vice president of the Florida Coalition. Nina's an experienced attorney, and Nina talks about the issue of waiver, about a women coming into shelter, and the possibility of seeking a waiver of confidentiality in the unlikely event of their death from any means. So Nina discusses those issues. Our position at NDVFRI has always been to operate within the bounds of the law and to acknowledge that the confidentiality privacy guarantees reside with the victim. So unless you get a clear waiver of that, that's where it stays. It's very important to have a look at Nina's piece and look at the discussions of those issues. More recently, Alicia Aiken, a very experienced confidentiality attorney who runs the Confidentiality Institute in Chicago, contributed a piece for us on more recent developments in the field of confidentiality. And we've got a webinar of Alicia's comments as well. So confidentiality guarantees vary across states, across tribal lines. Originally, folks were concerned that because teams had confidentiality, they could cover up malfeasance, negligence, poor performance, etc. That hasn't turned out to be the case at all. It's very difficult to get, in a country where you have a separation of powers, we have different powers of police departments and courts and prosecutors' offices and defense counsel, victim advocates, various shields. It's just not realistic to think that these cover-ups occur. It's very naive to think that happens. Agency representatives openly admit to mistakes in these reviews. But it's important generically to recognize the difference between public, private, and confidential information. And our attorneys on teams play a very, very important role in setting out these demarcations. And it's very easy for information to leak into reports that shouldn't. So it's critical that when you write reports, and some teams have become very, very skilled at writing reports, that you de-identify, that you anonymize, that you use pseudonyms, and that you make sure that you couldn't Google the case or the case study that you've put out, maybe as a half-page or a one-page vignette, that you Google that to make sure that you're not compromising someone's confidentiality, because it's relatively easy to do in this day and age, and it's important to pay close attention to respect those confidentiality rights. Most women who die have not resided in shelters. They just have not. And this, again, may be a way of speaking for the fine work that many shelters do in preserving the lives of battered women. Okay, I want to say a few words now about the possible consequences. I mean, why on earth should we do this work? What's the purpose of doing this work? This is within the domestic violence movement. This is very specialized work. I mean, this is not central work. This is sort of more boutique-y in a way, and it casts sort of a wide-angle lens on these cases. But some of the consequences, people have written about this in research. For example, a wonderful group up in Washington State found 2 simple, clear changes effected as a result of fatality review. For example, resources being made available for battered women with limited English proficiency, a very important provision. Another one, training police officers to routinely screen for suicidal tendencies amongst abusers. And we know that if someone's suicidal, we ought to consider them homicidal. And when we dissect intimate partner homicides, especially homicide, suicides, and the mass killings, we see an important role for depression, antidepressant medications sometimes, and perhaps a history of institutionalization for depressive tendencies. So these are things to look for, so important work. And we might think these are minor developments, but I think these are significant changes. The Montana teams, a shout out to the Montana team, again, like the Georgia folks, these are doing some fabulous work. Their recommendations out of Fatality Review led to the creation of a new strangulation law, led to updating the school curriculum for kids learning about signs of dating violence, improving the state's crime notification program, rendering DV advocates more able to screen for mental health concerns. In Montana, they developed a hope card, which I talk about in the film that appears at the bottom of our webpage on the Montana Commission. The hope card basically just contains the information about an order of protection. It's not a replacement for it, but it's like a credit card. So women can carry this around with them, or male victims can carry this around with them. It doesn't take the place of a court order, but it's not subject to getting screwed up, lost. You can present this to a police officer at a crime scene when the officer's there at midnight and you can't find the piece of paper that may have been destroyed by your abuser anyway. So new laws, new protocols, practices, there are many examples. If you go to our website, you'll see the reports, you'll see the changes that have been made. And these are modest changes, but these are important systemic changes that slowly contribute perhaps to better protections for victims and indeed sometimes for perpetrators. It's important to track these recommendations. Our friends in Florida do a great job about that. It's important to track whether they were implemented and to write about it in your annual reports. So that's important. I think Fatality Review definitely has contributed and has linked up with other coordinated community response initiatives. And here I'm talking about risk assessment. I've already mentioned that, but safety and accountability assessments or audits, family justice centers, Casey Gwynn and Gail Strack's phenomenal initiative to build those centers across the country. These are all sort of multi-agency initiatives where we bring players together, in a sense, using the aviation review model, that knowledge is power and that it enables us to gain some traction in the face of these difficult cases. I think that we've improved interagency coordination in many ways. People get to know each other. We do this formally, but we do it informally as well. Folks learn from the death review, from the emotional process of reviewing deaths. They learn who they can call. They develop social networks around the review process, and they develop trust. They build trust around a highly charged initiative, i.e. reviewing a case like this. So I've heard many people over the country tell me over the years that doing good death review, in-depth death review, where it's not for the faint-hearted, but where you do good death review, where you immerse yourself in the case, you talk to the parties. This is, in some ways, a life-changing experience, and it certainly changes the way people see victims, people recognize the compromises victims face, but also how they see perpetrators and the trauma that perpetrators themselves have often experienced over the life course. So it changes the way people work domestic violence cases in general. So people produce reports, it educates folks about domestic violence in general, provides opportunities to pursue new grant funds, but we don't want to be naive here. There are challenges that we face. There are things that we can't obviously have any impact on. Teams can devise preventive interventions, but they can't overcome these, whatever it is your particular horror is, whether it's, the evils of automation or bureaucracies or, global capitalism, if that's your evil, or whatever else it is. Fatality Review is not going to touch this stuff. Those structural things affect families, and particularly battered women and batterers. So they're important, but we're talking about a much more modest set of interventions. We need to know these things, and team members I know are aware of this. We need to know about implementation. We need to record how law and law-like systems are changed. We need to record how our teams expand. I'm going to review this month where we started. When I went to the state originally to train the team, there were 6 people in the training. The team formed with 8, 9, 10 people. Now there will be 47 people in that death review. So team expansion, how that's moved out into the community. We need to know about public education and awareness, shifts in collaboration, communication. We also need to know, and critically know, about changes in rates of intimate partner homicide, domestic violence related deaths. And we need to know that and set that against changes in medical developments. Are we really having an impact, or do we need to do some different things? We need to track shifts in resources, shifts in attitudes about cases. We've made a lot of progress in terms of alerting the general public over the last 30 or 40 years to the social harms caused by this kind of behavior. And there's been a major shift, a 30-40 percentage point shift in people's attitudes to this. So things are changing, and this is a global change. There's research in the social literature on this. These are global changes in attitudes. So we should take heart from that. Increased links of teams to government and links with things like risk assessments and other things. So these are the things we need to dig into. But teams also force us to look through the lens of the case at other issues. For example, they raise questions. Why doesn't he leave? Usually the abuser's a male and the killer's a male perpetrator, not always, but the question, people like to ask the question of victims, and some people think this is victim blaming, why doesn't she leave? I always thought that was an interesting question anyway, but why doesn't he leave as well? Because he pines and he clings and he stays, and there's a reason for that. It's linked to his emotional vulnerability, his dependency, his high level of abandonment anxiety, and sensitivity to rejection. So these are important issues about the psychology of the perpetrator that we need to dig into, because these issues and the secrecy of the offender, the aloneness of the offender, the depression of the offender, these things impact our safety planning methods. We need to think about this notion of control and concepts of things like coercive control. Does the concept of coercive control, for example, mean that control is realized? We don't see that when we review cases. What we see is the resistive maneuverability of victims right up until the very end. So we see the role of anger, the centrality of anger, and the inability to regulate anger as being important. The domestic violence movement has been quick to dismiss this. And I'm not suggesting for a second that anger management is the only way to move forward. There are many different ways to intervene and treat perhaps domestic violence offenders. But, anger is important. Another problematic issue is the issue of intent. What did an offender intend? We might be able to impute intent. We might think that an offender had tactics, but good fatality review that interviews perpetrators comes up with a much more complicated picture. Sometimes offenders don't understand what they're doing. They don't necessarily mean to do things. What the victim may have seen as him intending to do one thing may not have been his intent. Often when we look at the offender at emotional level, the development of strategy is much more complicated. Often these things are not purely simply intended. Now, we may apply the same logic to victims. We've had these older concepts. We have these older concepts of battered woman syndrome, the cycle of violence, learned helplessness, these various stock scripts that we have for understanding intimate partner violence. And we know that battered women have a lot more agency than these concepts of battered woman syndrome, learned helplessness suggest. We know from some of the work that these ideas about cycles of violence, specifically within the relationship, don't necessarily hold up very well. So fatality review really enables us to challenge some of these stock scripts through the complicated lens of the case. Now, if you don't like complexity, that may be uncomfortable and unsettling, but I would say that good fatality review is unsettling at a number of different levels. So the resistive maneuverability of victims and a strong sense of the complexity of the human condition. Traditional advocacy perspectives, for example, traditional law enforcement perspectives, may downplay that complexity. So understanding agency and understanding abuser behavior helps us with safety planning. We should be parlaying that stuff into the field just as we're parlaying the information about what happens before the homicide into our risk assessment analyses and the formation of community risk initiatives. One thing I will say from doing many years, 20 plus years of fatality review work, is that our victim advocates often do a tremendous job with safety planning, laying out, documents for victims, communication codes, secret words, where our bank statements are, this, that. I mean, really very sophisticated safety plans. And I used to also teach this stuff when I taught family violence at the university. And, this is all very, very good. But one thing that fatality review layers on top of all that stuff too is that victims can never really know what perpetrators are capable of. And this comports with Jackie Campbell's findings from her pioneering risk assessment work, in that victims aren't a good judge of what perpetrators are capable of doing. And this relates to the psychology of the perpetrator that I mentioned earlier. Perpetrators live very secretive lives, and they're often very ashamed of who they are. So it's very difficult for them to be read easily by victims. So I can't tell you how many times I've heard family members say, well, she didn't think he was capable of doing this, killing her, killing the children, or whatever. But sadly, he did. So this ought be something that renders our safety planning more complicated, perhaps, and maybe at some level, without being alarming to victims, more cautious, more guarded, more contingent. So I want to begin to draw to a close, because I know I've kind of droned on here for a long time, but I wanted to allow maybe 15 minutes or so for questions if folks want to ask questions. So I've got an old Chinese proverb here that I stole from my friend Peter Jaffe up in Canada. It is better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. We know what we're up against here with these heinous cases. This brutality is clearly a dark force in American and indeed global social life. We know that. But I want to quote to you from Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, in his tribute to Eleanor Roosevelt after her death. He was quoted as saying in November of '62, he commented, "I've lost more than a beloved friend. I've lost an inspiration. She would rather light a candle than curse the darkness, and her glow has warmed the world." And that's a very nice quote. So I wanted to just close here at 1:15 with you or so, at least my time, with this thought. Is it not possible that we can do our review work well, with respect for all those people at the table, and through the complex lens of lost loved ones, and in homage to them, that we can warm the world just a little? And do we not owe victims at least that, and indeed probably much, much more? So with that, I'm going to take a break for questions, and we'll see what we come up with. That's my contact information there. I will leave that on the last slide. So do we have any questions? We don't see any questions at the moment. Okay. Sorry?
We have somebody tapping.
Oh, okay. We have somebody tapping on their machine right now, so it'll just be a second and we'll see what comes up, if anything. So one question here, how eager have perpetrators been to speak to review teams? A very, very good question. You know, the simple answer to that is eager may be a strong word, but certainly willing is a word I would use. I've spoken, and I know a number of other people who've done perpetrator interviews and review teams. I've spoken with a number of people who've interviewed perpetrators, and they have willingly shared information about the case. So, for example, my dear friend and I, Matthew Dale, went up to a state penitentiary in Montana to interview a young man who had murdered his girlfriend. And we talked in great detail with him and learned a lot from him. And it wouldn't be fair or accurate to say he was eager, but he was willing. I've certainly experienced interviews with perpetrators who've been somewhat eager. I would be cautious about the word eager, only insofar as the eager perpetrator may be more likely to be a perpetrator, I don't know, who might be willing to rationalize. So that concerns me about the use of that word. But those perpetrator interviews, and there's a specific way to prepare for those, and Dr. Ferraro and I have a webinar in 2 weeks' time where we will talk about some of these issues. But the key there is forewarned is forearmed. Knowing the case really well and in detail before you approach the offender is a good way to drill down on things that you need to know and to deal with some of these issues about offender justification, etc. Another question, do you recommend that one person on the fatality review team ask all the questions to the family? Again, a very good question. Some people are very, very good at this. I have a colleague, Eddie Zuniga, down in Nogales, who's a former commander at the police department there, who's a superb interviewer. He has tremendous skills. And I would trust Eddie interviewing anyone, quite frankly. And, you know, Eddie, I know, has interviewed perpetrators in the course of his excellent review work down in Santa Cruz County in Nogales on that death review team. I know victim advocates, women who have tremendous interviewing skills, who may have been close to the family. There are some teams that choose to have maybe 2 or 3 people go in. The frame of reference here is, what does the family want? Where do they want to be interviewed? What's the best setting for them? How many people would they feel comfortable with? We have, for example, a number of our own staff who've had experiences of doing this. Our own Stephanie Mayer, a wonderful member of our team, has done some great interviewing in this regard too. So whether it's 2 or 3 people, we obviously don't want to overwhelm them. There are some review teams where the surviving family member or a co-worker wants to come in to the entire team. And if they're comfortable doing that, again, I've seen this and this done to great effect. So less so with family members, because obviously who've lost loved ones, that can be highly emotional, and they feel more comfortable often in smaller group settings. Relatedly, another question, do you have both victims and perpetrator family members in the same room at the same time? Obviously, the concern here with the answer to that question is, I've been in situations where that has happened, and where there's been some tension in the room, but usually that doesn't happen for obvious reasons of the potential of disputes or feuding or blame. We want to try and diminish those possibilities, so we try to reduce that, but occasionally that has happened. A very good question. Do all perpetrators have unattended ACEs? The ACEs score, the Adverse Childhood Experiences score, driving them to act this way to kill? That's a very, very good question, and if I had sufficient skill, I could do another webinar on this, but I don't. But I would say that adverse childhood experiences are a common theme. And again, to refer the questioner to our website coming up, both Dr. Ferraro and I have had a lot of experience of interviewing perpetrators, and we will address those issues and the research connected with it on that webinar. But the short answer is, I would say that most of them do. Whether it is the principal driver or whether it's a contributing factor is in some ways semantics. I think it's certainly one thing, but most perpetrators, whether they're male or female, of intimate partner homicide that I've interviewed over the years have had varying histories of physical, emotional, sexual abuse in their pasts. Now, obviously the caveat here is that vast numbers in the population have had these experiences, but they're not driven to the homicide. So this may be a contributing factor, but it's not the be-all and end-all of everything necessarily. So again, these are things that emerge through the review process. And my feeling about, working with perpetrators and also working with victims in near-death cases, those survivors, is that we can learn a lot about their past. And, not to say that the risk assessment tools that we have at the moment are inadequate, but the risk assessment in intimate partner violence cases is really in its infancy in many ways. And we need more risk markers on perpetrator, particularly perpetrator emotional biographies, and the kinds of things that they've experienced that indeed victims may know about that may drive their violent behavior, and so that we can intervene and provide supports or do other things. So these are important issues. How do ACEs, when victims tolerate abuse to protect homeschool-going kids till... I'm sorry, that I can't read that question, so... Okay, another question. This is from a Fatality reviewer. In several cases, we have had written communication with perpetrators. They didn't want to speak with us, but they were willing to write to us. And this is a very good point by one of the listeners. Yes, of course, you can take written testimony from folks, and that may be a very important way of gathering more information. So I think we're getting close to the end of our time. And do we have any more questions, Ray? I think we're good. So I think with that, I'd like to thank you very much for sharing some time with me, and thank all of you who are doing review work out there for the fabulous work that you do. And as I mentioned, there's tremendous work going on all over the country. I want to again thank the Office on Violence Against Women for supporting our initiative for so long. And I want to just remind you too that a recording of this will be available on our website, and once again, ndvfri.org. Please remember that we provide technical assistance to communities. We have funds to do that. It doesn't cost you anything to do that. We will do that in conjunction with other work in relation to domestic violence. So if you're interested, for example, in community-informed risk assessment, this is something that we also do. My full contact information is up there on the last page of the webinar. Please feel free to call my cell phone, leave a message for me, or email me, and I will get back to you within 24 hours. So we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you and goodbye.